Now you're in for something special. Our conference theme today is employee ownership, simply a better way of doing business. Now that's a very nice statement, but it's just an empty statement unless there are facts to back it up. Our keynote speaker is Joseph Blasi, the #1 employee ownership researcher in the world. In 2010, Joseph was named as the inaugural holder of the J. Robert Beister Professorship of Employee Ownership at Rutgers University, School of Management and Labor Relations. As mentioned before, he directs the Beister Fellows Program, which has now awarded 72 fellowships to individuals to conduct employee ownership research. Dr. Blasi has written 13 books, and his latest book, Shared Capitalism at Work, Employee Ownership, Profit and Gain Sharing, and Broad-Based Stock Options, which is co-edited with Douglas Cruz, also from Rutgers, and Richard Freeman from Harvard, is the basis for much of his talk today. We are very honored to have him with us. He's a very busy man. He flew in this morning. He'll be flying out after his breakout session this afternoon. If you do have questions for Dr. Blasi, I would definitely encourage you to go to his breakout session. It's a chance for an hour and a half, really, of follow-up discussion. But we are very honored to have as our keynote speaker. Let me present to you Dr. Joseph Blasi.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I grew up in a little town called Music, Pennsylvania, which is between Scranton and Wilkes-Barre in the coal mining area. And so Ohio feels very much like Pennsylvania to me. So I'm delighted to be here. After the American Revolution, George Washington had a huge problem. The British decided to systematically destroy the cod shipping industry. The colonies, before the American Revolution, fished a lot of cod. It was one of the major exports. They had a lot of ships. It employed a lot of sailors from New England. But the dirty little secret is that the cod sailors doubled as the Revolutionary Navy. And the British feared that if they lost the war, they would have a navy on their hands. So they went out of their way to destroy the ships and the industry of the cod fishing industry. It was even a family business, because when the cod were brought in, they would dry them. The whole family would dry them. A lot of the cod were exported to Catholic countries and to various countries in Europe. So just as he was elected, President Washington decided that now that we were a nation, he had to fix this problem, because now he really did want a navy. Okay, and the British, for them, the American Revolution was temporary. So Washington calls in Thomas Jefferson. And by the way, this is really a true story. Washington calls in Thomas Jefferson, who has just returned from France, right? He was ambassador to France on behalf of the revolutionaries. And he says, you're going to be Secretary of State, and your job is to chair a committee to bring the cod industry back. And so Jefferson, and you can look into the Jefferson papers, he spent a lot of time writing about this. Jefferson liked to write about everything that he did. And so Jefferson did some searching around, and he saw that, well, there was this case in France where they were having trouble with building a part of a fishing industry, and they had given some incentives to the sailors, to the shipping industry to do that. So he came up with this idea that every cod ship of a certain tonnage, and it was progressive, the bigger the tonnage, the bigger their incentive, would get paid an incentive by the federal government if they went out and fished in cod season, which meant that you had an incentive to build the ships and to put them out there and rebuild the whole export industry. And the owners of the cod ships, because a cod ship was very much like a publicly traded company, it sold shares to rich people, lawyers, doctors, rich industrialists. They sent a letter to, to the Secretary of State. Remember, there was only a few cabinet departments there at the time. And they said, "This is a great idea, Thomas Jefferson. You just send the check to us, to the owners of the ships, and we'll take care of everything else." Well, meanwhile, the actual workers and team leaders of the cod industry didn't like that idea, because you may not realize this, but for over 100 years, there had been complete profit sharing on the catch in cod ships. So from the captain down to the lowest person, they shared. Okay, it was a form of shared rewards, shared capitalism, an ownership culture. And they said that didn't really sound right to them. It sounded unfair that the incentive would go all to the owners of the ships. So they petitioned Jefferson, and interestingly enough, even some of the richest industrialists of the time, there was a rich industrialist who had warehouses in Philadelphia, which, as you know, was a big port at the time, and he wrote a letter to Alexander Hamilton's assistant, Tench Cox, at the Treasury Department, and he said, "You know what, I have observed that the fishermen who share in the catch are more productive on the ships than the ones that don't share." So Jefferson decided in the end that the bill, the law, which subsequently became law when George Washington signed it, said that the incentive paid to the cod shipping industry would be distributed 60% to the workers and team leaders and 40% to the ship owners. And not only that, in one of the first pieces of legislation passed by the first Congress under the first President of the United States, it reads that before the ship goes out, the captain and the owners must sign a written agreement saying that they will continue the custom of complete profit sharing on the catch, subject to judicial penalty. Okay? So you can see that the idea of a shared ownership in the results and profit sharing really goes back far to American history. Now, as you know, Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton were like two cats in a bag. They just hated each other. They couldn't stand each other. And who had the job of actually implementing this? Well, the person who was in charge of the custom houses, namely the Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. This is one of the only issues on which he and Jefferson agreed. In his first report to the new Congress, called the famous Report on Manufactures to the U.S. Congress, he praised the incentive idea with the cod fishing industry. So this is just an idea to let you know that some of the things you're talking about, some of the themes, excuse me, go back really far. There we go. Go back really far in American history. So what I want to do today is take you through a little journey about what we've learned in really over about 30 years of research on the idea of worker ownership. And I'm going to move fairly quickly. Excuse me. So let's start out with this general overview. How much worker ownership and profit sharing is there in the United States? We've done a survey of the entire U.S. population. You'd be surprised to know that about 18% of U.S. citizens own company stock, not as much as workers and managers own in ESOPs, but still there is a thin layer of worker ownership in the U.S. population. About 9% receive stock options. That may surprise you, since there's only 5,000 public companies, and they each have 5 top executives that report to the SEC, so that's just 25,000 people. Okay, so there's a lot of people who get stock options, workers and middle and lower level managers in firms in the United States. So it goes a little deeper than you might think, being in the more intensive employee-owned firms and cooperatives. About a third of workers receive cash profit sharing or gain sharing. Now, for worker ownership, the average amounts, when you average it all out, they're fairly small, about $10,000, 25% of 1 year's average salary, and so you can compare the average amount of worker holdings in company stock with what you have in your companies. But the really interesting thing is one half of private sector workers in the United States have either cash profit sharing, stock in their company, or stock options. It's usually a small amount. But I'm simply pointing this out just to give you some overall numbers and to give you a sense that if this thing were ever to be big, the infrastructure is kind of there. People are familiar with these ideas. And it's prevalent in many industries. So these numbers tell you the percent of all workers in those industries, all workers, not just public companies, that have company stock. I'm just focusing on that. So 47% in communications and utilities. Okay, that's picking up a lot of internet companies. 31% in durable manufacturing, 24% in non-durable manufacturing, 24% in durable manufacturing, 24% in finance and insurance, 21% in computer services, 21% in retail, and you can see the numbers start going down. This is based on a survey done every 4 years by the U.S. government called the General Social Survey, and we receive most of the funding to do this survey from the Employee Ownership Foundation, sponsored by the ESOP Association. Now, so how do we study worker ownership? How do we try to find out about these ideas? There have been more than 100 studies over a quarter century that show that there's better performance, better economic performance, and better worker attitudes on average in companies that have significant worker ownership. And today I'm going to talk very briefly about what we've learned from this General Social Survey. What is it? It's a random sample of the whole U.S. working population. Okay? So if you find something from the General Social Survey, it probably is true. It's a random sample. The second study I'm going to talk about is a study our book is based on. We looked at over 40,000 workers in 14 companies and over 300 work sites. And we gave them really intensive 20-page survey about their attitudes, their behaviors, their views on the company, how they work, these kinds of things. So we're going to talk about that. And then the third study, we've been challenged. People have told us, why can't you just look at really big companies that people are familiar with? So many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with Fortune magazine's 100 Best Companies to Work For in America issue. Every year, about 400 companies apply, and there's 100 who win this contest, 100 Best Companies in America. The Great Place to Work Institute that prepares the list for Fortune gave us access to the data. All the companies that apply do a random sample survey of their workers, and management fills out a culture practices survey. So we're going to talk a little bit about this, our most recent study. In all these studies, we use a lot of fancy statistical techniques to make sure that we're really finding what we think we're finding, and make sure that we control and pull out the effect of gender and age and tenure and these kinds of issues. Now, why would this kind of research be useful to managers and workers? Well, one, it's a way to see if your ideas about how your organization works can be tested scientifically. It's a way to get beyond your individual stories and see if some general things might be true and what those things are. It's a way to benchmark your company and what you think about these ideas. And it's a way to decide what changes and ideas you might want to pull forward in the future. So let me start quickly going through some of the general things that we've learned. And I'm not going to talk statistics. I'm going to talk about some general themes and ideas. The first things that we learned is that combinations are really common. So managers nationwide tend to combine short-term profit sharing and gain sharing with longer-term worker ownership and stockholding. In fact, according to the General Social Survey, remember that survey like the census of a random sample of U.S. population, about 40% of workers involved in worker ownership are involved in these kinds of combinations. So managers are telling us something. They're using the short-term reward and the long-term commitment to company ownership together. I think managers are suggesting this may be something they think is optimal. The second thing we learn is that participative culture is more common in companies that have worker ownership. So managers appear to be combining the right to share in the company performance with the ability to affect the company performance. So worker owners nationally are more likely to say they have a lot of say in their job, that they have help in setting things up at their job, and they make decisions with others at their job. So I'm sure you've heard a lot this notion that employee empowerment and participation is the best way to do it, worker ownership. What this national census survey, census-like survey shows is that managers nationally get that. They have more employee empowerment when they have worker ownership taking place. About a third of the workers who have worker ownership in the country are actually in self-managed teams, and a third are in employee involvement problem-solving groups. Now, in the 14 companies that we really put the microscope on, okay, under intensive study, worker owners tend to be in teams. They tend to have lower supervision, and I'll talk about what that means in a minute, more involvement in their jobs and department decisions, more training, and more job security. So what does this idea of lower supervision mean? What it means is that a lot of worker owners in the country report that they don't have close-in supervision. They're not overly monitored by supervisors. Supervisors tend to play more of a role of a coaching role, of an overarching role. It doesn't mean that they don't have supervisors. And it's a really interesting idea because we've always wondered, why do we keep finding that worker-owned firms are more productive? Well, one of the things we might be learning here is because they may spend less on their managerial budget. Fair pay and fair benefits are more common in worker-owned firms. Most worker owners in the United States, and when you see GSS, it means it's this random sample of the whole U.S. working population, they report that they're paid at or above the market rate for their region or job. And this is a really important finding. It would be really depressing if we found that worker stock ownership, employee stock ownership was replacing fair wages. That would be a really depressing thing if we found it, and if that's where industry wanted to take this concept, would be really upsetting. In ESOPs, workers are more likely than other workers not in ESOPs to have a second diversified defined contribution plan or even a defined benefit plan. That's based on research that Rutgers has done on the Form 5500, the Labor Department's record of ESOPs, and the NCEO has done. So it appears from all the studies we've done that worker-owned companies are more generous. Part of the reason may be that if they're more productive, they can afford to be more generous. Next, one of our big findings is that workers like some risk. We spent a lot of time coming up with a very complicated instrument to measure whether these 44,000 workers in our big study were risk averse or risk loving, whether they hated risk or whether they loved it. And we gave them a whole series of questions about their betting behavior and whether they play the stock market and all kinds of questions. And we came up with a pretty good idea of who the risk averse workers were and who the risk loving workers were. And only 22% of workers among the 40,000 want all their compensation in fixed pay. The interesting thing is workers with different approaches on risk aversion still like a combination of worker ownership and profit sharing with their fixed pay. So 86% of workers who have a low risk aversion want that. 75% of workers who have medium risk aversion want that. And 66% of workers who hate risk still want some worker ownership and profit sharing mixed with their fixed pay. People have figured out in an economy where wages are pretty much flat, adjusted for inflation, that they would prefer to have an opportunity for a share in the company. However, we did find out that high insecurity workers do not respond well to worker ownership. And I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. But if you ask a worker, the size of their fixed pay. The smaller the size of a worker's fixed pay, the smaller the number of times their saved up wealth is as a multiple of their fixed pay. And the more that they feel that they're underpaid, if you add that all up and make a big score, they're not likely to respond very well to worker ownership, right? They're looking for cash. They're looking for cash. So you can't tell a worker who is in a very insecure situation to love stock. Another thing we found is that shared capitalists monitor and help each other. Most workers can tell if their co-workers are working responsibly. But I'm going to quicken up a little bit. As you know, the biggest objection to the employee ownership idea and the profit sharing idea is shirkers. I'll let the other guy work and then I'll collect my stock. It's the biggest objection by economists. And what we have found is when you increase the amount of worker ownership and profit sharing, workers monitor each other. And why do they do it? They tell us they do that because that person is messing up my share of the ownership. And this monitoring increases the more you have employee involvement, teams, job security, and formal training, and pay them fairly. So the more you have a worker ownership culture, the more you get this natural monitoring. And it's this natural monitoring which partly accounts for the low supervision, because it replaces the normal policing and monitoring that management and really hierarchical firms do. We find that culture matters a lot. We find that culture matters a lot. What we find is that the bundle that really works well with worker ownership is high performance work practices, meaning high amount of formal training for workers, job security, involvement in employee involvement teams, and self-directed work teams. If it increases as if a worker owner, the impact of culture increases when workers are paid fairly. What we find is that the combination of worker ownership and this positive culture, this combination of training and high performance work practices like job security and teams, together that's what accounts for improved willingness to work hard in these companies. Ownership and culture reduces turnover. That's the really big finding of this study. The intention of a worker to leave a firm is cut by half when you combine the right culture with significant worker ownership and profit sharing. We find that worker ownership improves workers' attitudes and behaviors. They report that they're more loyal to the firm. They have lower absenteeism. They have more willingness to work hard. They have a greater perception that their co-workers are working harder. They make more suggestions, and they have more willingness to innovate. But this is true, all these advantages, only when you get the culture right. Only when you get the culture right. And what is the culture again? Fair pay, not too close supervision, high performance work practices, which means the combination of formal training, job security, and self-directed or employee involvement work teams. Now we find that worker ownership alone drives all these positive results. But as I said, it's the combination of worker ownership that does really well in terms of getting more productive behavior. I want to speed ahead a little bit and ask the skeptical question, our study of 44,000 workers with intensive surveys, our study of a random sample of the US population, could it be a delusion? Maybe we somehow messed up. Maybe we didn't find what we really thought we found. So what we did is we came up with another study using the 100 best companies to work for in America list. We took data on about 800 companies that applied for the competition to be the 100 best companies in America. And we really ramped it up now. We had 400,000 worker surveys and management surveys on about 800 companies. And to make a long story short, this was the largest assessment of worker ownership, profit sharing and company culture ever done by researchers in the United States. And basically what we found is that we found the same conclusions that we found when we looked at a random sample of the US population, and the same conclusions that we found when we studied these 40,000 workers really closely in the United States. So this is a very serious test. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit and conclude by saying, what do you do with this? I think one looks at the issues in your own firm with an occasional employee survey and facilitator to figure out how to transfer some of these ideas to what you see as your experience. I think it's important to support research where you can with giving researchers and consultants that you work with access to your firm. And I think that it's important to understand the impact of this kind of research on the national debate about employee ownership, because these ideas will never get on the national agenda if serious research doesn't prove that they are doable, practical, and workable. And so with that, I'm going to conclude by saying that that's why, as Bill mentioned, at Rutgers we are focusing on developing a fellowship program where we have scholars, young scholars, and from all over the country, and not so young scholars, from all over the United States, who we are trying to mentor. We're talking, many of these scholars are young doctoral students, young assistant professors, because we need to have people all over the country, in all the states and all the universities, studying these ideas, coming into your firms, learning from you, offering to give you some ideas back, and that's the sort of special role that we do. I do want to stop for a moment to remember John Logue, my dear friend and person that you know has contributed so much, and to remember the Ohio Employee Ownership Center. We do research, we work with fellows and young scholars, but I understand what it means to build a network like this, the first in the nation, probably the best in the world, and you don't know how precious it is and how lucky you are to have the staff of the center and to have yourselves the reality of what you're doing here in such an intense way in the Midwest. So congratulations to you, and thanks for inviting me.
Thank you, Joseph. Well, as we know, maybe making employee ownership work isn't really simple, nor is it easy, but it is rewarding. And as Joseph pointed out from the research, you get the benefits when you combine the actual ownership with the ownership culture. And I think everybody here would agree that you never can say, we have an ownership culture, and then stop, because the minute you say that, some new employee walks in through the door, and guess what? They don't have the culture. It's a continual process of making sure that the culture exists at the company. But when you have it, and you combine it with the actual ownership, you get better results, and because you're getting better results, you can pay yourself more. It's a win-win across the board. Joseph, thank you very much, and I'll repeat again that Joseph and Jackie will be conducting a session, the breakout session right after. George Cheney was supposed to be part of that. Unfortunately, he is ill today, so he will not be able to join in that presentation with them. But I have a feeling that that Joseph and Jackie will have no trouble filling the time, and I'm sure that you folks will keep them busy with your questions too. I would like to recognize two ladies who I know are not in this room because they're in at the registration table. But they are the ones who are primarily responsible for this conference being a success. Our office manager, Kelly Fitz, and our clerical assistant, Pam Haydock. Please give them an extra loud round of applause so that they can hear you. Thank you. They are wonderful. The coffee break this afternoon is again in this room, same setup at the back of the room there near the exhibitor displays. Closing reception starts immediately after the last round of panels in the boardroom downstairs at 4:45. And last but not least, please fill out your evaluation form and leave it in the box on the registration table. Hope that this day has been worthwhile to you so far. Hope that it continues to be worthwhile for you. And enjoy the rest of the conference and safe travels home. Thank you very much. See you next year.